Well, good evening. It's good to see you this evening. For a few months now, we've been going through a study on Romans on Sunday evenings, and I thoroughly enjoyed that study, but we've studied it pretty extensively up through chapter 7. And I've decided, after thinking with summer coming up, we're going to take a short break from that study to relieve you from that study if it's been a little bit too heavy for you, and then we'll come back to it a little bit later on in the year, and at that time we'll do a review and a comprehensive exam to make sure that you remember everything that we studied over the past couple of months. But we will eventually come back to that, and I look forward to it. But we'll take a short reprieve from it and come back later. Recently, I was reading through an institution that I follow that monitors the persecution of religious groups, specifically those who are professing Christians in other parts of the world. And one of the areas that they focus in on, and one of the countries that they try and bring awareness about, is actually the country of Nigeria. And over in Nigeria, those who profess Christ are being persecuted severely. They're being tortured. Their property is being confiscated or burned. Their houses are being burned. Their family is being held for ransom. And there was one story I was reading about a man who was kidnapped and then tortured. And then his family was taken captive, and the only way that they would allow his family to be released is if he signed over his property to the captors. And so essentially, he now has no means of making a living now that he has been freed, and now they're demanding more ransom. Another story I heard, I forget, I'm not sure, I don't think this individual was from Nigeria, but from one of the Middle Eastern countries, of a man who was a Muslim, essentially the equivalent of a Muslim minister. And he was challenged by someone to read through the Gospel of John. And he did so because he was going to refute the claims of Jesus being the Messiah. But at the end of that study, he actually came to faith and came to believe that Jesus was actually the Messiah. And during that journey, he wrote this journey down and his study down in a journal that he kept hidden from his family. But one day, he came home and he saw his mother standing outside with a group of men from their community. And she was holding his journal that she had found. And she said, "Is this true?" And he said, "Yes, it is." And she came up to him and she slapped him, and she took off her shoe and she slapped him, which is a mark of offense in that culture. And she says, "If this is true, then you are no longer my son." And the men from that community commenced to beat this man to within an inch of his life. And when he was telling this story to another individual, he saw the look of shock on this person's face, because this happened within the past couple of years. This is recent times. And when he saw the look of shock on this man's face, he said, "That was the price." And he said, "What do you mean?" He says, "That was the price for me to follow Christ." Now, generally speaking, we don't have to suffer those types of things in our country. But you may not be aware of the fact that persecution of individuals who profess faith in Christ is growing increasingly more hostile at this day and time in other regions of the world. And I would encourage you to pray for Nigeria and to pray for other countries and other individuals that are suffering in that way. And so we'll probably, I'm sure, I have no doubt that certain amounts of social persecution, if you will inevitably increase within our country. I do believe that will happen. But generally speaking, we're not called to make great sacrifices like that. We don't have to pay those prices. And yet the Bible still talks about us dying. It still talks about us putting something to death, crucifying the self. In fact, in Luke chapter 9 and verse 23, Jesus said that if we're going to follow after Him, we have to be willing to take up that cross and follow after Him. But I do think that when you're having to suffer maybe in a physical way, that it's kind of easy to say, okay, this is how I crucify the self, because these worldly pleasures and all of these things are being taken away against my will. But when you're living in the comfort and the ease of American society, how do you go about crucifying the self? How do you really go about taking up that cross of self-denial that Jesus talks about in Luke chapter 9 and verse 23 and fulfilling that mission of being a cross-bearer? That's the question I want us to briefly look at tonight together as we look at 4 ways to crucify yourself. 4 ways to crucify yourself. And I think there's 4 practices that Scripture gives us that can help us to crucify the self. And the first one is, and this might surprise you, but the first one is actually evangelism. Evangelism. And evangelism is the crucifixion of acceptance. The crucifixion of acceptance. We generally like people to like us, don't we? I don't know. There are a few individuals who I know who I really think they don't really care if anybody likes them, right? The way that they act towards others and their attitude. But deep down, even those individuals, I think they want to be loved. I think they want to be accepted. And I think they want to be liked. Okay? But we generally like to be accepted by individuals. We don't really like confrontation, although Paul does talk about individuals who have an unhealthy appetite for confrontation, and there definitely are those, even within the church, sadly. But we don't like to be rejected. We don't like to be marginalized. We don't like to be outside of the circle. We like to be accepted. And we have to be very careful, because if we're not, the idea of acceptance can become an idol in our life. We'll do anything and say anything to be accepted by either the majority or by a particular social group that we want to be a part of. And so acceptance can become an idol within our life. The difficulty is that, again, in American culture, we generally operate on the idea of wanting to be accepted. We have social media that kind of gives into that idea of, we want to have posts that are liked and shared and videos that go viral. We've created this culture where we want acceptance. But the reality is that we see throughout the Gospels and within the life of the apostles is that if you're going to live a godly life, there are going to be individuals who will not accept you. In fact, there are going to be individuals who will outright reject you. Paul says in 2 Timothy 3 and verse 12 that if you're going to live a godly, pious life, you're going to suffer persecution. That might take shape in different forms, but it does take shape. Well, let me rephrase that. It takes shape if we're actually living that godly life. If we're actually doing what Paul's talking about there. If we're living a holy life, and if we're actually reaching out to share the gospel with other people. Now, over the summer in our auditorium class, we're going to be doing a more extensive class on evangelism. We had our Bring, Teach, Keep seminar back in February, and we're going to take some of those things in our Sunday morning AM class, and we're going to try and put that in more practical terms so we can be better in our evangelism. But one of the things, for those of you who attended that seminar, that Chuck talked about was how we're concerned because we don't want to be rejected, right? We don't want people to say no. We don't want people to think that we're awkward or that we're weird or that we're out of place or that, we're those weird religious people, that we don't like being rejected. But Chuck also talked about, just as a side note, is that, there might be that one yes out there, but you might have to go through 15 no's before you get to that one yes. But what's happening as you're going to people and you're asking them, hey, would you like to study the Bible? Hey, would you like to come to worship? Hey, would you like to come to VBS? Can I sit down and talk to you about Jesus Christ? Can I talk to you about what He's done for me, what He's done for the world? And over again, when people say, no, I'm good. Thank you, no. What's happening in that? I think there's a lot of things that's happening, but one of the things I do believe that's happening is that we are helping ourselves to crucify the idol of acceptance in our life. It's causing us to step outside of the box of our comfort zone, and it's causing us to reach out to people and actually having to endure in some small measure, and I say a very small way because it can't even compare to what Jesus and the apostles and others are enduring, but it helps us to share in some small way the rejection that Jesus himself endured. The cornerstone being rejected in Ephesians 2, right? He is the rejected one. And if we are going to embody who Jesus is as the Church of Christ, then we have to learn how to, in some way, share in that rejection. To be rejected by those who do not want the gospel. And in fact, would even be hostile to the gospel. Evangelism, of course, is a part of our identity as God's people and reaching out and sharing the faith. But I also think there's some disciplinary aspects to evangelism that we sometimes don't think about. And again, that makes us really uncomfortable. Someone saying no, or someone being even maybe frustrated with us even asking them about that. But I do think that within this, we are able to crucify acceptance and the idol of acceptance in our life. The second area in which we can crucify the self is service. Service, which is the crucifixion of convenience. The crucifixion of convenience. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, Paul talks about how we're not only supposed to look on our own interests and our own needs, but to look on the needs of others. And then as an example of that, in verses 5 through 8, he gives Jesus Christ, who though he was in the form of God, did not count himself equal with God, but made himself and came as a man, right? And became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And so what we see there within Philippians chapter 2 is that Jesus was willing to debase himself. He was willing to humble himself to the point of being a servant. And he was crucifying the idol of convenience. It's not convenient to serve someone. Let's just be honest. If we're being absolutely honest, we have to take time out of our schedule. We have to make an effort. Sometimes we have to spend money. And sometimes we have to get uncomfortable. Sometimes it takes a lot of energy. It's not very convenient to serve someone else. But that's the point, right? Is that we're not serving the self in that moment. We're serving someone else. And again, we're given an opportunity to share in the ministry which Christ himself partook of. That is at the heart of embodying the mission of Christ by becoming a servant, the Son of Man, the servant of humanity. To be a servant to all in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, and to give his life as a ransom for many. I jokingly, we were doing our VBS meeting earlier, and I kind of jokingly said, it's kind of funny that we're talking about how to crucify ourselves tonight, right after we've had a VBS meeting, because that's really, these great efforts that take so much energy and so much effort on the part of the church, and so many little things that have to come together to make this happen, and other events that we have happen. It requires you as members, all of us together, to say, you know what, for 3 days and maybe even a little bit before that, I'm going to look at the interest of other people ahead of mine. I'm going to look at what they need, what's important for them, above what Jacob needs and above what's important to Jacob. I'm going to crucify the self. Yes, is it inconvenient? Yes, it's inconvenient for me. But there's a greater cause which I have been called to, and that is to crucify the idol of inconvenience within my life. So service allows us to crucify the self by crucifying convenience. Thirdly, there is worship. Worship, which is the crucifixion of self-adulation. The crucifixion of self-praise. Right? If any culture ever needed to learn how to crucify the idol of self-praise, it's my generation, right? The me generation has sometimes been called, the selfie generation. There's this constant desire to be praised and to have compliments and to have likes. And that does become an idol in which the man is exalted. The self is exalted above God. And I think that goes all the way back to the beginning, in which Adam and Eve exalt the self above God. But within worship, we are called to come and to recognize that there is something, that there is someone that transcends the self. That there is someone greater than me, that is worthy of far more adoration, far more praise than I am. That He deserves all of the glory. And so worship is not simply a means of giving God something, but it is also a means of giving me something. Disciplining the self. To where I recognize that this isn't about what Jacob wants. This isn't about Jacob getting the glory. This is about God getting the glory. This is about Him getting the praise that He deserves, because it's not all about me. And if for one day in the week we do that together collectively as a people, that's so important. But we recognize we should be worshiping Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Right? Sunday should just be a reflection of what we're doing the rest of the week. Praising and worshiping our God and living for Him. So worship is the crucifixion of self-adulation. And then fourthly and finally, there is benevolence, which is the crucifixion of comfort. The crucifixion of comfort. If you have ever taken the time to do a service project in a homeless community, or if you've ever taken someone who has been down on their luck and you've helped them, and maybe it's someone in Austin that you see on the streets and you take them to get a room or to get food, or maybe you try and get them hooked up with different institutions within town to help them get back on their feet. If we're just being honest with ourselves, that's not always comfortable, is it? It kind of gets us out of our comfort zone. We're dealing maybe with people we don't normally deal with. And we feel uncomfortable with that. And sometimes when we go to other service areas and we're serving people where it doesn't smell so good, or it's kind of uncomfortable, or it's too hot, or it's not very comfortable. But Christ never called us to comfort. Jesus never called us into a discipleship of comfort. In fact, He called us into a discipleship that eats with people that the rest of society wouldn't really eat with. That spends time with individuals who maybe the other people think, well, they're the dirty lots of society. They're the sinners. They've made too many mistakes. They're there and they deserve to be there. They're the ones that have made those bad decisions. They made their bed and they need to lie in it. I don't like that phrase, by the way. I really don't, because we've made some beds that we really don't like to lie in. And yet people give us grace and mercy. And I'm glad that God didn't look at us as humans and say, well, they made their bed, they're going to lie in it. Right? I don't really like that phrase. But when Jesus comes, He reaches out to the people, and He's not in comfortable situations. He has people who have these terrible diseases like leprosy. Have you ever seen someone who's been affected by leprosy? Horrible, terrible disease that ravages the body. These people were so horrendous to the society around them that they would be placed in colonies. And if they were within a certain distance from someone else, they would have to yell, "Unclean, unclean," so that the person would know and couldn't come to them and definitely didn't want to touch them or even breathe the air that they're breathing. And Jesus has these people coming up to Him right in front of His face and asking to be healed. And He doesn't stand off 100 feet and say, okay, you're good. He goes in Mark chapter 1 and He touches the man. He touches the untouchable. As a church, if we're wanting to embody the mission of Christ and to fulfill this crucifixion of the self, then we have to be willing to touch untouchable people. We have to be willing to reach out to individuals who might make you a little bit uncomfortable, who might make you Get out of that zone that you're used to being in. But that's what it means to be the church of Christ. If we're going to follow Christ, that's the path that He leads for us. And in serving those people and in helping those people in their time of need, before you begin to realize that you are crucifying a part of you that doesn't need to be there. This kind of clinging to comfort that we have. And I think this is probably one of the more important disciplines that we need to practice, because we've become so accustomed to comfort in our day and time, right? I mean, I was just thinking, Grady and I went to Bend, Texas this past week, and we were traveling there, and Grady had a few stories to tell. I know that doesn't surprise you, but we were talking about, how long of a trip it would take in the wagon, the horse-drawn wagon. Trips that take us an hour today would take a week or more, right? And not that Grady was back during those days, but his grandparents were, right? And his parents were. At least I don't think you were. So no, he told me some great stories about it, and it just showed me how much can change within a generation. And now, we can drive an hour or even 4 or 5 hours, and it's air conditioned, and we get to listen to the radio, or even the kids might watch TV. We get to stop at Buc-ee's, everything's comfortable. And then, of course, we still complain. If the radio signal's not coming through good, or if it's songs on the radio that we don't like. We still find ways to complain. So we've become addicted to comfort. And I think it's very important for us and our society to find ways to crucify that idol of comfort. So 4 ways to crucify yourself tonight and throughout the coming weeks: evangelism, service, worship, and benevolence. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the lesson, if you're going to follow Christ, He says in Luke 9 and verse 23, you have to take up your cross. You have to be willing to take up that cross and follow after Him. There's no option. There's no option of that. Jesus said, if you're going to follow me, you've got to take up that cross. And that cross leads to only one place. The cross and the way of the cross leads to only one place, and that is Calvary. That story only has one ending, and that's death. But on the flip side, resurrection and glory. And that's why Jesus says the person who tries to find his life will lose it. But the one who loses his life for my sake will find it. Have you found your life tonight by losing it to Jesus Christ? If not, why don't you come as together we stand and as we sing. I have resolved,